Hey there, welcome. Today I'm going to talk prequels, in particular prequels in Star Trek. Um, I find of late I'm getting, I suppose, what can only be called prequel fatigue, because that's seems to be the go-to for franchise media, in particular films and TV. And I'm not sure it's working. Certainly not for me. But let's go Star Trek. Now, the last Trek series before the Berman era, as it's often called, ended was Enterprise, of course, which was a prequel show. And at the time, fair, okay, they were trying something new, and that's cool, I suppose. Trying to explore a different part of Star Trek that hadn't been done, because at this point, of course, they've done TNG, they've done DS9, which of course was a complete departure from TNG and indeed TOS as a result. Then they did Voyager, which was basically TNG all over again, narratively speaking. I mean, yeah, the premise was different, but let's be honest, the show didn't live up to its premise at all. So they tried, let's do Enterprise, let's try something new, we'll do a prequel show. Um, I'm aware that Brandon Braga, he wanted to do a temporal, like time travel type thing. Um, but since the prequel was forced upon him and Rick Berman, Brandon says he wanted it to be set primarily on Earth, at least for a while. Just, to do something again different with Star Trek. So it's not just the same old ship out there, you know, meeting new species every week and so on. Which personally I think was a really good idea. The whole let's do it on Earth and show you how humanity built the first, starship, Warp 5 starship. The beginnings of the Federation, the beginnings of Starfleet. But obviously that wasn't to be because the networks wanted it out there because it's Star Trek. Because they obviously failed to grasp that just because it's called Star Trek, it doesn't need to be a trek through the stars. I can see the argument for why it should be, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be. DS9 proved that. You can still find ways to get out there and trek while still being stationary. And DS9 proved that in spades. But obviously that's what the network wanted, so they created Enterprise, which is I was going to say Patrick Montgomery, not Patrick. What's his name? Something Montgomery, I feel sure. The guy who plays Travis, whose name now escapes me. Sorry, I think Anthony Montgomery actually. He says on the Blu-ray for season 1, they were promised this great new thing, doing something that Star Trek's never done before, and they ended up basically doing the same again. So he always understood why fans were disappointed. He was disappointed. And that was fine. That was the end of an era, and they was trying to do something new, but not really. And whenever I watch Enterprise, I do struggle to see it being 100 years before TOS. I don't think it necessarily comes across very well. I mean, they try, trying to retro the tech, phase pistols and feather phasers. They've got grappling hook instead of tractor beam. They've got what was it? A polarized plating instead of shields. But it's all much the same. It's just new names for the same sort of stuff they did in the rest of Star Trek. Instead of showing you them developing this stuff, the transporter technology initially was very untested, but by the end of it, they was using it quite a lot and very easily. So again, it never really went where it needed to go. It's only season 4 where they really start to do prequels, where they start setting up stories. Although I do feel, as a whole, Enterprise was too busy setting up the TNG era of Star Trek, not the TOS era, which to me was a huge misstep because, like, well, this is 200 years before the TNG era. So if you keep meeting aliens and get discovering tech that's so common within that era, then space becomes very small. Because the whole point is, of course, in between TOS and TNG, they've mapped so much more of space. So they've met all these new alien races by TNG, like the Ferengi, the Borg, and they've developed all this new tech that they never had 100 years before in the TOS era. So it seemed odd to me that they're having Ferengi, they're having these other characters and situations that are very TNG centric, and yeah, it's just too much, and I just find it hard to credit it's a prequel to TOS. I mean, I've got some fundamental issues with it. I always figure one way they could have solved this is by not having it called Enterprise, and indeed not having a ship be the Enterprise, because the legacy of, and the lineage, rather, I suppose is more accurate, of the Enterprise, it's such a huge thing by TNG era in particular. You know, there's been, what, 6, I think, ships in Starfleet, certainly, during the Federation time at least. That's how they try to argue it. Called the Enterprise. So by the time we get to the Enterprise D, it's got this amazing lineage, it's important legacy. And I think it stretches the imagination, the narrative, to say that there was a pre-Federation Enterprise that not only did it contain the first Warp 5 engine, but it also was integral in the founding of the Federation. And the idea that that was never mentioned in the narrative of Star Trek before being set after, of course, just it stretches the old story to me. It's like, how can we honestly conceive that as making sense? Yeah, of course, real world, they hadn't come up with the idea of it yet. But then if that idea was never postulated on the TV shows that were set afterwards, then it shouldn't have been in a TV show that was set before, because it makes no narrative sense that they would never know this. Because because within the narrative, cause it's all about within the narrative, right? You have to. I know some people argue, well, it's not an historical document. It's like, well, yes, it is within the narrative of the show. These eras of Star Trek are historical fact of the Star Trek universe. I.e. TOS, what we saw, the way it looked, the ship designs, the uniforms, the technology, the aesthetic, that is historical fact within the Star Trek narrative. DS9, of course, confirms that very explicitly when they actually all go back to an episode of TOS, and they make a huge thing of this is literally how how this era 100 years ago looked. So it absolutely is a fact within the narrative. But by having the Enterprise, rather having the NX-01 be an Enterprise, creates a huge flaw within that, because visually we have seen a few times displayed the lineage of the Enterprise. In the motion picture on the rec deck, there are images of the 1701 and various ships with the name, like a space flight, a shuttle, the Navy ship, proper sailing ship, which were all ships called Enterprise. Which, of course, it's like, well, if in the narrative the NX-01 was such a huge part of Federation history, its image would have been there. Obviously, it wasn't created within the real world, but this is not the real world we're talking about, the narrative. And the whole point I'm making is the problem with doing prequels. It has to fit what we know. Obviously you need a bit of leeway because you need to tell stories and do something a little bit different to keep people's interest. But then I would counter that maybe you don't, because surely the interest of the fans following it is to see how these building blocks were put together, how things link together. And of course, when we're talking lineage of Enterprise, throughout the first 4 seasons of TNG, on the wall of the conference room, there was every ship of every starship called Enterprise. And there's also an image of the Navy ship Enterprise. So again, where's the NX-01? And that's true of later films when you've got new models of the Enterprises on the Enterprise E, you know. So yeah, that was my issue with, certainly with Enterprise itself. It's so hard to make this fit. I mean, you could just about make it fit if you ignore TOS. It fits as a sort of prequel to TNG era, but not necessarily, in my view, as a prequel to TOS, which, problem. So, and of course, you could argue that's part of why Enterprise failed as a show, because people weren't invested. Maybe lots of people were not buying it in that regard. And so what do they do when they finally bring Star Trek back, first to film and then TV? In film, they bring it back with a prequel series with Kirk and co. They are, at least they do the whole cake and eat it bit of, they want to do a prequel film, but they'll also make it a sequel in so much as these events are a consequence of Spock from post-TNG going back in time and changing the timeline. Of course, it doesn't really work because, again, prior to Spock's arrival, prior to the Narada's arrival in Star Trek 09, we see events happening on the Kelvin. And just a visual cursory look, it's very clear that these ships are crazy in advance of the TOS era. They've got these multicultural crew, which, I'm sorry, but that's not really what happened in TOS. I know it's a reflection of the time, cost saving, all this stuff, but again, in the fictional narrative, ships tended to be mostly humans or mostly aliens. Like you had a Starfleet ship that was pretty much just Vulcans. The Enterprise was primarily humans, and Spock was the exception, And that is the historical fact of that era of the future, according to Star Trek. An era which, by the way, was very much a sexist and quite racist era. And that's fact. That's within the narrative, which, again, would have been more interesting to me, just in the general sense of doing prequels, is that, okay, yes, it's all good, Star Trek's meant to be this ideal world, utopia, all this stuff, but the fact of the matter is, within the fiction, the TOS era was kind of racist and so sexist. And considering what's happening in the world today and how the far right in particular, are getting such a powerful voice, and how much sexism is coming back, how much racism is getting pushed to the fore again, and it's not necessarily acceptable, but it's certainly more vocal than it has been for, and it's more problematic than it's been for quite a while, probably. So it's conceivable that actually, in another 200 years, society, certainly humans, become quite sexist again and sort of borderline racist again. And surely, if you're doing a prequel set within that historical era as defined by the narrative, then you've got some interesting stories to tell where you've got characters who are flawed, who are kind of sexist again, who are a bit racist again. So you get to tell stories and look at why this is wrong, and why, by TNG era, they've overcome this again. That humanity goes through pits and troughs. It's sometimes it's good, sometimes it's bad. So it could have been a good chance for a good exploration for Enterprise to do, and certainly the new Trek prequel to do. Speaking of new Trek prequels, all the issues I have with Enterprise are compounded and exploded with new Trek. Because, again, like I said, they did a prequel, not wholly successful. So, for some odd reason, franchises have this kind of obsession these days of doing prequels to everything. I'm not sure why. Are they really that popular? Fear the Walking Dead did it. Obviously, Star Wars has done it many times over. And it's a weird thing to do because I think that if you're going to do a TV show or film that's a prequel to an existing TV show or film, then you need to replicate the look of these things. Otherwise, what's the point? Star Wars, for instance, right? This will make sense with regards to New Trek in a moment. Every Star Wars prequel they've done, not counting the prequel films, because they were obviously deliberately looked visually different because they were quite a while before, like Rogue One, Kenobi, Andor, any Solo, all the films are set as a prequel to the original Star Wars trilogy. They always copy the look visually, like the technology, the uniforms, all the aesthetics, because they're aware that that is the historical narrative look of that era. And they also clearly know that fans will be perfectly fine with that. They can accept that. But for some peculiar reason, Star Trek fans, or certain fans at least, and maybe the producers, it seems, seem to think that modern audiences wouldn't be able to accept a TV show that has a retro design. So they do, say, Discovery, for instance, they make this, another prequel, and visually, it is all over the place. I mean, cinematically, it looks fantastic, right? New Trek all looks cinematically fantastic. It looks brilliant, it's beautiful, it's all these things. But aesthetically, the uniforms, the technology, the ship designs, they tend to harken more as the evolution that began within the TNG era. All the ship designs, for instance, look to me like the evolution of design from the Enterprise D, E, and so on. They're all using the Starfleet Delta, which of course isn't the Starfleet Delta to the motion picture, despite what the so-called intent of the producers were apparently on screen, with a few notable exceptions. Only the Enterprise used the Delta. But then, of course, it became the franchise trademark, and in the Kelvin films, they've all got it. That's not good, but you can argue against it because it is an altered timeline, maybe. But then you come along to Discovery, which at that point was 10 years before Kirk's time, and they've all got the Starfleet Delta, even though it's not. It's only the Enterprise badge at this point. But then you've got all the aesthetics, you've got the hologram tech, you've got just the visual tech, the look, everything. And then you've got, of course, the design of the aliens, the Klingons being the most obvious. And I'm all for doing something different, But every time I watch Discovery, especially the first two seasons, especially season one, I just there's really no reason for this to be a prequel. A few minor changes and it would have worked as it's not a sequel as such, but certainly as a further advancement of the Star Trek that we saw in the TNG era. It could easily have been 100 years later with the technology they were showing. The Klingons looking so different could just be another stage of evolution of the Klingons from what we saw through TOS to Next Gen and so on. The ship designs being so radically different could have been just, again, they've changed it, 100 years later, they've changed. This Klingon Earth War or Federation War easily could have been taken place much later. Michael, if she had to be linked to Spock, she could have, her foster father could have been Spock's son or something, so she was like a sort of granddaughter. All the narrative stuff they did in Discovery could easily have been fixed by not making it a prequel. but it is a prequel. And so by season 2, they've got all the negative response, but especially of the Klingons and various other things, and the idea that Spock's got a sister that he's never ever mentioned. I mean, and by season 2, the producers are bending over backwards to try to find ways to make this fit by changing things. The Klingons suddenly all look different. Suddenly, these elongated skulls of theirs are now normal size skulls almost with hair. So they look more Klingon. And it's like, so, and they use that rubbish excuse of, oh, we shave our hair during war, which of course we've seen Klingons at war before, and that's never been a thing at all. It's just nonsense. It's just the producers trying to have their cake and eat it, trying to find a way to appease fans. And see, I would have embraced Discovery more, I suppose, if the producers had the balls to say, no, this is an alternate take, this is a new iteration of Star Trek, but set within that era, but it's our version of that era. I would have appreciated more, because it's like, well, at least you've got the balls to say you're doing something different. You're not necessarily retelling stories, but you're reiterating and you're creating a new iteration of that era for a modern audience, as opposed to saying this is the prequel to the series we saw in the 60s, which of course is crap. Because again, like I say, all the sexism, all the crap that's on display in the TOS era could have been amazingly wonderful narrative to play and to look at today's issues. Show why sexism is wrong, show humanity learning again, But instead they've made it very progressive, which, necessarily not a bad thing, obviously, because it should reflect today's world, but at the same time, it could have done it in a more clever way if they'd embraced, what TOS really was, the fiction of TOS. But instead, they've gone the opposite way, and they've made it that within the narrative, if we are to accept that it's set within the same actual timeline, that within the next 8 years or so, humanity is going to become quite racist again. They're going to be becoming quite sexist again. The technology is going to take a complete nosedive. All this, the way the transporters being used for site-to-site transporting and all this stuff. All these wonderful things will suddenly be forgotten because site-to-site transporting, for instance, is a TNG thing. It wasn't a thing on TOS. They always used a transporter platform to initiate or to receive at least. You could never just transport from one to one. There's one time in Day of the Dove where that's a thing, and it's made clear in the text that intra-ship beaming, as it's called, is a very exceptional thing to do. It's not the norm. But of course in Discovery and later in Strange New Worlds, it's absolutely just perfectly normal. Whereas it never happened. Literally, even in the TOS films, you always see people transport off the platform or onto a platform because the technology wasn't there. It wasn't a technology that was devised until some way between the TOS movies and the TNG era in the narrative. So we have... So yeah, Discovery... I struggle. I think Discovery improved from a narrative sense when it jumps forward to the 32nd century, because then it can actually start telling stories that are new. It can explore things, that we've never been able to explore in terms of narrative in Trek, because we're now in an era of Trek that's never been explored, other than a few time travel stories maybe. I'm not saying it's necessarily done well, because I think, for me certainly, season 3 and 4 are a little bit boring, really, and it's a bit stretched out, and it's, I don't know, it's not my Trek. I'm not saying it's bad necessarily, because obviously people like what they like, but it's certainly not. It's not the sort of Star Trek I would go back and rewatch random episodes of. I'll rewatch it because I'm a Star Trek fan. I'm a completist, so naturally, I will watch everything. I may not like everything, but I'll rewatch everything because I am a Trek fan and that's what I do, unfortunately. Which brings me to Strange New Worlds. Um, yeah, I've seen season one finally. My basic thoughts are it was overhyped, I think. People, again, a certain section of fandom, because, fandom is a wide thing and lots of different opinions and different views and different people. But it seems a lot of people bought into it, I think, in a blinkered way. With rose-tinted glasses, they've got this image of TOS era that's not true. If you watch the TOS, you have to look at the real narrative of what you're being presented. You can't just take the best parts of it. You have to take the crap, including, as I say, the sexism, racism, the crap tech, the attitudes to female captains, for instance. Huge problematic, sure, absolutely agree, but it is what it is, and it was a fact within the narrative of Star Trek. And that women, for instance, were not able to be captains, at least before the films, is an interesting narrative that could be played with. You could imagine you could have stories where you have women in Starfleet wanting to be captains but are being forbidden to do so for some sort of return of politics. And you could have discussions about how humanity has not improved since now. How equal rights are not as good by the 21st century as they are now. You can actually have some good discussions. You can have some, stuff that people can relate to because the struggle still goes on today. As much as equality is better than it has been for quite a while, it's still not perfect and it's still a constant battle. It's still, there's always that imbalance, unfortunately, and it's a continual struggle. So you could actually tell these stories through Star Trek if you just embraced what TOS really was. My other gripe with now, before I go say gripes, I will say Strange New World looks lovely. It's visually stunning. I think it's classical in its sense of it's telling the story, new story every episode, new planet every episode, all this stuff, and that's good. It's different, I suppose, from Discovery, different from what Picard did, different in many ways from what Project D and indeed Lower Decks does. So that's it's good, and it does give people who want that episodic Star Trek something, and that's a good thing. And the performances are all good. Nothing against the actors at all. I think they all do great work. They do well. Scripts are, they're pretty well written for the most part. I'm not saying they're perfect, but they're pretty well written. So there's lots of positives. But once again, my problem comes down with it being supposedly part of the so-called timeline narrative that TOS is going to pick up in 8 years. So yeah, one of my biggest gripes is that all the legacy characters within it, and there are quite a few, are either there when they shouldn't be. Like Nurse Chapel, it seems unlikely. I just don't buy that she was there presumably at least 8 years before Kirk was. Watching the original TOS, that doesn't strike me as she's been around and she's known Spock for like 8 years or so, because her very unhealthy obsession with Spock in TOS doesn't convey that at all. And of course, I seem to recall in Amok Time, she has no idea about Spock's girlfriend, no idea about any of it. Of course, in Strange New Worlds, she has absolutely every idea about it because she meets T'Pring. And there's so many narrative choices they've made where it's just like it's pissing all over, frankly, TOS. The producers recently said they're aware that they're playing with the canon a bit, by having characters being places they probably shouldn't be, being around each other they probably shouldn't be at this point. However, they need to do that to tell interesting stories, which is absolute, if you excuse the phrase, bollocks. You can tell interesting stories in a prequel without messing around with the narrative that you're supposedly part of. But that's my biggest gripe. All the legacy characters, as I said, either they're not meant to be there, or for me, by the end of the season, I'm like, I recognize the names, but the characters as they're portrayed, and this is not the actors' fault, because obviously they don't write the scripts, I don't recognize them. I don't recognize Nurse Chapel being the same character. I don't recognize Uhura being the same character. I recognize Uhura being easily a younger version of the Uhura from the Kelvin films, being this linguistic genius, but that's not Uhura from the original TOS. She was a capable officer, absolutely. Strong, independent woman, yes, she was. But even by Star Trek 6, she still has to consult dictionaries and stuff to translate things, because she's this linguistic expert. She can't just hear a language and just translate it and work it all out just like that. She's the communications officer. She wasn't this prodigy. She wasn't this genius. She was in the Kelvin films, and now this version of Aurora is in Strange New Worlds, which is, no, it's not that character. Pike's different because we only saw Pike in TOS in the beep chair, as many people call it, and he never actually spoke, so we don't really get a sense of his character. So the character of Spike from the cage till 13 years later in Menagerie, there's absolute room for improvement. Nothing's locked down, so they've got the freedom to do a lot of different things with Pike, and they do, and that's fine. And Anson Mount's fantastic. But yeah, who else? Mbenga. It's hard to square him being the chief medical officer of Enterprise 8 years prior to TOS, when he was only in 2 episodes of TOS. And although a doctor, he was clearly junior to McCoy. So it's like, that just doesn't ring true. It's like, why couldn't you have had, I don't know, Philip Boyce, I think his name was, from, was it Boyce? I think it's Boyce in the Cage. I'm pretty sure it's Boyce. Whichever it was, the doctor from the cage. It could have been an old man. So that's something different. Have an older character, a grumpy, old-fashioned, sawbones type doctor again. Different from McCoy, and certainly different from all the other young characters in the show. It would have been, again, more interesting, but no, they didn't. Then you've got the whole thing with Lan, because in Space Seed, nobody really knows anything about the Eugenics War in TOS. Nobody really knows anything about Khan. I've heard of Khan, except for MacGyver as the historian on the ship. But in Strange New World, you've got Spock in close proximity to this character for presumably at least 5 years. Everybody seems to know about Eugenics Wars. Everybody knows who Khan Union Singh is. But in 8 years' time, suddenly everybody's forgotten, including Spock. And it's just like, it makes no sense. It just doesn't work. It's irritating, frankly. And now I want to say this, absolutely, this is not about race, okay? I'm absolutely 100% all for representation. As a gay man, representation is important. You need to see yourself in the fiction, so I think, you should have more non-white characters. Absolutely, 100%, I'm all for that. But I am, especially if it's in the same timeline, recasting characters from to one ethnicity to the other, I think, is a silly, odd, strange thing to do. If it's a different timeline, again, I'd have no issue with it at all. Recasting Robert April as a black man, I would have absolutely no issue if it was set within the same timeline. If it actually was, if it wasn't set within the same timeline, sorry, because then it's a different iteration of the character, and that's absolutely 100% fine. Representation, fantastic, all for it. But if it's supposed to be the actual same character we saw in the animated series, then it's like, how does that make sense? Because the animated series is canon. And many of people who are saying, well, it's just animated, so why can't he be a black actor now? It's like, well, you can't accept the animated series as canon unless you accept it for what it was. And Robert April was a white bloke, an old white bloke, you know. And the thing that irritates me most is that he's never actually called April in the on screen, and there's nothing in the story where his connection to the Enterprise, being the first captain of the Enterprise, has any bearing on any of the narrative beats anyway. It's never mentioned. It seems to me, it comes across very much as they've done it just because they can, you know, and it's just pointless. You could easily have had this admiral be a black guy who has a connection to Pike, and it still works. There was no need for it to be Robert April, you know, because it creates problems. It creates a discussion that's almost always going to be an ugly discussion, and it's never going to go well. So what's the point? Why create problems? You know what I mean? Why, other than just to be like fan service, because that's all it's for. It's just fan service, because narratively there's nothing that says it needs to be Robert April at all, you know. So yeah, absolutely create characters for black people. Absolutely create characters for non-white actors. 100% do it. Absolutely. Hell, you could have half the cast on the bridge be non-white, and I would be for that, you know. But don't change the ethnicity of another character. If you check, you know, especially if it's been established, it's just, why do it? Why create problems, you know? Especially as you can't, if you're going to accept the animated series as canon, then you have to accept what we saw as canon. You know, the Kzinti are the Kzinti. Robert April was a white guy, you know. So if you're going to have him in the show, then why? It's just, yeah, I don't get it. It's just, and I think the arguments that people are making, and them just arguing for it, especially some of the people who accept TOS as canon, it's like, well, you can't have it both ways, you know. Especially as within the narrative, there is no reason for him to be Robert April anyway, which makes it even more of a problem, frankly. You know, and the same thing for Kyle, the transport chief, who's this young Asian kid. If he is supposedly meant to be the same Kyle we see later in TOS, how can you honestly say this young Asian kid later becomes this middle-aged, gruff, I think meant to be Irish, white guy? Again, it's like, there's no need for it. You know, it just creates problems that don't need to be there. And if he's supposed to be a different character, why call him Kyle? Why call him Kyle unless he's meant to be the same character as a transport chief as well, so he's got the same position? Why create problems? Why play with the canon when there's no need for it? It's just, it irritates me, because it's, I mean, again, representation, yes, but you're creating false representation now you're creating a problem, you know, you're creating a problem because now in the narrative of the show you've created a problem. The problem isn't having non-white people on screen, because of course that's not a problem, and anybody who thinks that's a problem are idiots, frankly. If you've got a problem with race in any way, you're fucking, well, you're thick as shit, clearly, and you know, you're just a bigoted idiot. But in a narrative, if it is one narrative, then it's got to be consistent. Otherwise, why bother? And that's my fundamental issue with prequels. You know, that's why I've got prequel fatigue. I think I'm just fed up of prequels now. It's like, why can't you move a franchise forward? Why are you always trying to do the building blocks of something that already exists if you're not going to make it fit? You know, what's the point? What are you hoping to achieve here? You can still tell good stories by not doing prequels. I mean, like, coming up season 2, they've got Kirk going to be a recurring character. Kirku's going to interact by what we've seen with Lan. Kirku's later going to have no idea who Khan is until he's told by an historian. Kirk, who, by his own dialogue, only met Pike once when he handed over command of the Enterprise. Kirk, who now apparently is going to be fairly familiar with Pike. Again, why do prequels if you're not going to make it fit? See, I come from a place where I run a prequel series of novels, right? And I'm absolutely aware that you have to have a bit of wiggle room to create new things, to do some stuff that keep people interested, right? And I'm all for that because I do that too. But I have this argument with my publisher a few times where he suggests some stuff, and I'm like, no, it doesn't fit, so I'm not doing it. Unless I could be plausible, at least I won't do it because it has to at least fit, or at least plausibly fit. And it's easier to do in book form, of course, because you don't have the aesthetics to worry about. You don't have to worry about, the audience won't be able to accept a retro-looking show, which, as I say, is bullshit because Star Wars proves that. You just have to worry about the narrative. And if you go beyond the aesthetics of the prequel Trek shows, which, problematic, even if you go beyond the aesthetics, the narrative doesn't fit. I mean, and again, it's just pleasing fans, but that's a whole nother video, fan service. But anyway, these are my thoughts on prequels. I'll watch them because, again, like I said, I'm a completist, and I've been following Star Trek properly since the 80s. I watched it in the 70s when it was on TV and reruns and whatnot. But I really followed it from the 80s, from like the mid 80s, I guess, 86 or so. Just in time for Next Gen, so that was lucky. Which is probably why Next Gen's my favourite Star Trek. So I've invested so much of my time in this show that of course I'm going to watch all the new shows. I may not like them necessarily, but I'll watch them because I'm a completist. And in my head, all these prequel shows are like alternate timelines anyway, because it's the only way I can watch them and not be really irritated by them. Although even in the back of my mind it's still there saying, well, the producer's intent is that they're part of the original proper timeline, but yeah, it's you you can't have your cake and eat it, right? Isn't that the phrase? If you're going to make a prequel series, make it fit. If you can't make it fit, don't make a prequel series. And honestly, don't make prequel series, man. Just do something new. I mean, Star Trek, we've had the 24th, we're now in the 25th, so with Picard and hopefully Star Trek Legacy coming forward, we'll advance the franchise again. We'll start to literally explore new worlds. Yeah, I struggle with prequels, clearly, And once again, changing cast ethnicity is not a race thing for me, it's a narrative thing. 100%, that's the only issue I have with it. It doesn't fit the narrative. And I'm very much all about, when I invest in a fictional universe, be it books or TV or film, then I like it to be consistent. I like it to evolve. But you can't evolve if you do an evolution beforehand. Evolution is moving forward, not going backwards and trying to squeeze it into the gap. You can't create a missing link that doesn't exist. If there's no link, there's no link. So those are my thoughts. Hopefully people have other thoughts, and if you do, please do share them in the comments below, because it's a discussion to have. I'm sure there's others out there who agree with me, and there'll be others out there who will vehemently disagree with me on this, and that's fine too. Absolutely fine. It's only a TV show at the end of the day, and good fiction provokes discussion, be it topical discussions on politics or gender equality or racial equality, all these things, or it could just be discussion about creative narratives, and consistency and all these things. So yeah, If you've got any thoughts, comment below. If you don't, meh. Or comment on social media, because obviously I'll be sharing this there. So yes, I am bored of prequels. But I will keep watching them. Go figure.